10,000 years of freedom ended in a single day. Think about that for a moment. 10,000 years. That's older than the pyramids, older than writing itself, older than civilization as we typically define it. And it all came crashing down between sunrise and sunset on one particular day in 1876, when mirror flashes from mountaintops carried messages faster than the swiftest horse could run. Across the Great Plains, an invisible network of light located 90% of the scattered Sioux bands before the sun touched the western horizon. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because to understand how an ancient civilization fell to dots and dashes of reflected sunlight, we need to rewind the clock. We need to go back to when the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota peoples, collectively known as the Sioux, ruled an empire of grass and sky that stretched farther than most Americans could imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The buffalo gave them everything, and I mean everything. Homes from hide, those iconic tipis you've seen in photographs, were architectural marvels, engineered to withstand prairie winds that would flatten modern tents. Tools from bone, scrapers, needles, awls, each piece of the animal transformed into something useful. Thread from sinew strong enough to last generations. And wisdom, oh, the wisdom that came from watching the great herds move across the plains, like living rivers of brown and black. Picture a young Lakota child, maybe 4 or 5 years old, learning to ride before they could properly walk. Their father would place them on a gentle colt, steadying them with one hand while the horse moved in slow circles. Meanwhile, their sisters played with miniature teepees, learning the mathematics of angles and the physics of tension that would make them the engineers of their mobile cities. This wasn't play. This was education for survival in a world where your home needed to move with the seasons. By the time a boy reached 16, everything changed. He would seek his vision alone on a sacred hillside, fasting for days, waiting for the spirits to reveal his purpose. Can you imagine sending a 16-year-old alone into the wilderness with no food, no water, no shelter, just faith and tradition? But they came back as men, ready to count coup against Crow and Pawnee enemies, ready to take their place among the warriors. Counting coup, that beautiful, dangerous game where touching an enemy with a stick brought more honor than killing him from a distance. It said something about their values, didn't it? The 7 council fires of the Sioux Nation gathered each summer in assemblies that would put modern political conventions to shame. 20,000 souls, creating temporary cities that moved with military precision across territories larger than France and Spain combined. These weren't random wanderings. This was organized. Strategic movement based on centuries of accumulated knowledge about weather patterns, game migration, water sources, and defensive positions. Then came the horses. Those magnificent creatures the Sioux called sacred dogs, escaped from Spanish herds hundreds of miles south, gradually working their way north through trade and capture. The transformation was instantaneous and total. Within a single generation, the Sioux became the finest light cavalry the earth had ever seen. Better than Mongols, some historians argue. A mounted Sioux warrior could fire 20 arrows with deadly accuracy, while a cavalry soldier managed to reload his rifle once. Let that sink in. 20-1. Chiefs like Red Cloud earned their eagle feathers through cunning raids that became legendary. Each feather told a story. A battle won, an enemy touched, a coup counted. Medicine men like Sitting Bull dreamed the future in sacred ceremonies, their visions guiding the people through crisis and plenty. And here's something white observers consistently missed. Women owned the teepees. They decided when camps moved. Their voices carried equal weight in councils, despite what patriarchal Victorian Americans assumed when they saw these societies through their own cultural lens. This was the golden age. This was the height of Sioux power and prosperity. It seemed eternal, as permanent as the grass itself, as endless as the sky they lived under, until gold in the Black Hills, the sacred Paha Sapa, where warriors went to seek visions, and where spirits were said to dwell in every shadow and stream. The Laramie Treaty of 1868 had promised in writing, with signatures and seals, that these lands would remain Sioux territory as long as grass grows and water flows. Beautiful language, that. Poetic. Binding. You'd think, but American promises, it turned out, proved lighter than prairie wind when fortune beckoned from sacred ground. When prospectors found gold in those hills in 1874, the treaty became just words on aging paper. Within 2 years, thousands of miners swarmed into Pahasapa like locusts, each one carrying pick and pan and dreams of wealth, each one a violation of solemn vows. The Sioux watched their world beginning to crack. The buffalo herds, once numberless, were being systematically slaughtered, not for food, not for hides, but as a military strategy to starve out the Indians. The sacred hills were being torn apart by men who saw only yellow metal, not holy ground. The old ways, the 10,000-year-old ways, were under assault from a civilization that moved on rails and spoke through wires. War was coming. Everyone knew it. The only question was what form it would take, and who would still be standing when the dust settled. What none of them knew, not the chiefs, not the warriors, not the medicine men with all their visions, was that the weapon that would ultimately defeat them wouldn't be rifles or cannons. It would be something far more insidious, something you couldn't see coming across the plains, something that traveled at the speed of light itself. But first, blood would have to be spilled in the Montana grass, and a man named Custer would have to die. The death of George Armstrong Custer shocked America to its core. On a blazing hot June day in 1876, combined Sioux and Cheyenne forces had done the unthinkable. They had annihilated 5 entire companies of the 7th Cavalry at a place called the Little Bighorn. 268 soldiers dead in less than an hour. Custer himself, the golden-haired boy general of Civil War fame, stripped and mutilated on a Montana hillside. It was supposed to be impossible. Primitive peoples with bows and arrows don't destroy modern armies, equipped with rifles and trained in European tactics. Except they did. Warriors led by Crazy Horse. Gall and other chiefs had proven something terrifying to the American public, that technological superiority didn't guarantee victory, that the Indian problem might not have a simple military solution, that maybe, just maybe, the people they'd been trying to push aside actually knew how to fight. In Washington, generals demanded revenge. Politicians demanded results. Newspapers demanded action. The public wanted blood, wanted vindication, wanted proof that civilization would triumph over savagery. But here's the thing about revenge. It's rarely rational. The army couldn't just throw more soldiers at the problem. The plains were too vast, the Sioux too mobile, the terrain too unforgiving. Traditional military tactics had failed spectacularly, and everyone knew it. The solution, when it came, arrived not from bigger guns or more soldiers, but from an ingenious device that most Americans had never heard of. Something that could send complex messages using only sunlight and mirrors. Something that would revolutionize warfare and doom the Sioux in ways no one could have predicted. The heliograph looked deceptively simple. Picture a circular mirror, about 8 inches across, mounted on a tripod, with a shutter mechanism that could be opened and closed rapidly. That's it. That's the entire apparatus. But in the hands of trained operators, this simple device could flash Morse code across 50 miles of clear air, station to station, creating an invisible telegraph network that required no wires, no poles, no infrastructure whatsoever. Colonel Nelson Miles, commanding the 5th Infantry and one of the Army's most ruthless Indian fighters, immediately grasped its potential. While Sioux scouts watched for dust clouds on the horizon and cavalry movements on the ground, they couldn't see conversations conducted in light itself. Miles understood something fundamental. The Sioux advantage had always been information. They knew the terrain better, moved faster, communicated through smoke signals and mirror flashes of their own. But what if the army could see everything, coordinate everything, respond to everything faster than horses could gallop? Signal Corps Captain William Volkmar got the assignment. Establish heliograph stations on peaks overlooking traditional Sioux hunting grounds, each manned by specially trained soldiers who understood angles, atmospheric conditions, and the mathematics of reflection. It sounds technical, and it was. These weren't just soldiers pointing mirrors. They were mathematicians calculating how sunlight would bounce off polished metal, how atmospheric conditions would affect visibility, how to compensate for distance and elevation. The first stations went up in fall of 1876, just months after Little Bighorn. Soldiers lugging equipment up mountainsides, establishing positions on peaks the Sioux had used for generations to spot buffalo herds. The irony was brutal, using indigenous observation posts to track indigenous peoples. But the true revolution came when Miles coordinated multiple stations simultaneously. This wasn't just one mirror talking to another. This was a network, a web of light stretching across hundreds of miles, all feeding information to central command posts that could process, analyze, and respond in real time. On a crisp December morning in 1876, 22 heliograph stations from the Yellowstone River to the Missouri began coordinated operation. Think about that logistically. 22 stations, each positioned for maximum visibility, each manned by operators who had spent weeks learning the terrain, mapping Sioux winter camps, bribing agency Indians for information, tracking movement patterns. This was intelligence gathering on a scale the frontier had never seen. As the sun rose that morning, mirrors began flashing from peak to peak. Large camps spotted near Tongue River, approximately 3,000 souls, moving northeast. The message traveled station to station, reaching headquarters in hours instead of days. Other stations reported simultaneously: small band crossing at Powder River Ford, fresh pony tracks near Rosebud Creek. Smoke signals observed south of Yellowstone. Within hours, not days, not weeks, but hours, converging columns received orders. Supply trains redirected, artillery positioned, cavalry moved to intercept. The Sioux had always relied on superior mobility and intimate knowledge of terrain. But now, the army could coordinate faster than horses could run. They could see movements before the dust settled. They could predict destinations before bands arrived. By sunset that first day of coordinated operations, commanders possessed something unprecedented: a comprehensive map of Sioux positions across 800,000 square miles. Bands that had evaded pursuit for months were suddenly fixed like butterflies pinned to paper. No more vanishing into the vastness of the plains. No more ghosting away from slow-moving columns. The very advantages that had made the Sioux unconquerable were being systematically neutralized by reflected sunlight. But here's what made the heliograph truly devastating. It wasn't just about tracking hostile bands. The network allowed the army to monitor which bands had surrendered, which remained hostile, and which wavered between resistance and starvation. The reservation agencies became intelligence centers where friendly Indians reported on their hostile relatives in exchange for rations. The government could now play bands against each other, offering food to some while starving others, all coordinated through instantaneous communication. The ancient unity of the 7 council fires began to shatter against the cold efficiency of military bureaucracy. When one band surrendered, the heliograph network ensured all other bands knew about it within hours. When warriors raided supply trains, converging forces appeared with suspicious speed. When medicine men tried to rally resistance, their locations were transmitted faster than runners could carry warnings. The Sioux began to realize something terrifying. They were being hunted not by soldiers on the ground, but by information in the air. By messages they couldn't intercept, couldn't decode, couldn't stop. They could shoot arrows at cavalry. They could ambush supply wagons. They could count coup on foolish officers. But how do you fight conversations made of light? How do you ambush reflections? How do you count coup on sunbeams? By spring of 1877, the network had expanded to over 40 stations. The army knew where every significant band was located, where they were headed, and when they'd arrive. Military operations that once took weeks of planning now happened in days. The noose was tightening, not through superior force, but through superior information. And the Sioux, those magnificent warriors who had ruled the plains for generations, who had defeated Custer and terrified settlers, who had built an empire on horseback and freedom, they were being defeated by mirrors and mathematics. Crazy Horse learned about the talking mirrors from a Crow scout who had switched sides twice. The man had fought with the Sioux at Little Bighorn, then surrendered to the army, then slipped away from the agency to rejoin the hostile bands. He was the kind of man nobody fully trusted, but everybody listened to because he moved between worlds and brought back information. He sat across from Crazy Horse in the war chief's teepee and described what he'd seen. Soldiers flashing messages from peaks his people had used for generations to spot buffalo herds. Light talking to light across distances no rider could match. Crazy Horse listened in silence. He was known for this, for hearing everything and saying little until the moment for words arrived. That night, he dreamed of spider webs made of light, strangling the earth, each strand invisible until you walked into it, each connection stronger than sinew. When he woke before dawn, sweat cooling on his skin despite the winter cold, he ordered his band to move immediately. No breakfast fires, no delay. They needed to be gone before the sun rose high enough for the mirrors to speak. But by noon, cavalry approached from 3 directions. The mirrors had already spoken. Through what the Lakota called the winter of despair, band after band faced the same impossible choice: surrender or starvation. The army's new strategy was brutally simple, and brutal simplicity often proves most effective. Locate camps via heliograph. Surround them with converging columns, coordinated through mirror flashes. Then wait. No need for bloody battles when hunger did the work. No need to risk soldiers' lives when winter and depleted food stores would break resistance better than bullets ever could. Dull Knife's Northern Cheyenne learned this lesson in a dawn attack that had been coordinated entirely through heliograph signals the day before. Cavalry struck from the east just as infantry closed from the west. The timing so precise, it seemed like magic. They lost their entire winter food supply, thousands of pounds of dried meat, buffalo robes, tools, everything that would have sustained them until spring. By afternoon, women and children were already showing signs of exposure. By the next morning, Dull Knife was negotiating surrender terms. 2 moons, another Cheyenne chief held out longer. His band kept moving, kept dodging, kept trying to stay one step ahead of the coordinating columns, but the heliograph signals revealed his exact position to artillery units that shelled his camp from distances his warriors couldn't return fire from. Not enough to cause massive casualties, just enough to scatter the band, destroy supplies, keep everyone running and hungry and cold. After 3 weeks of this calculated harassment, 2 Moons rode into the agency with his head down and his people starving. Even the great Sitting Bull, the holy man who had dreamed the vision of soldiers falling into camp at Little Bighorn, even he couldn't fight invisible networks of information. He fled north with 4,000 followers, crossing into grandmothers. Canada, where American soldiers couldn't follow, but American agents could still bribe and cajole and spread rumors. The heliograph stations tracked his movements to the border. Then Canadian authorities took over surveillance. Within 2 years, his 4,000 had dwindled to a few hundred as hunger and the impossibility of remaining free made the choice for them. Freedom or food, pride or survival, the old ways or tomorrow. The reservation system operated with mechanical precision that would have impressed factory managers back east. At the Red Cloud Agency, beef distributions occurred every 2 weeks, just enough to prevent starvation, never enough for comfort or independence. Warriors who had once tracked buffalo for days across territories larger than European kingdoms now stood in lines waiting for rancid meat butchered by government contractors more interested in profit than nutrition. Agent James Irwin kept meticulous records in leather-bound ledgers. 4,372 Indians enrolled. 1,894 hostiles surrendered. 643 children sent to Carlisle School. Human beings reduced to numbers. Existence measured in rations distributed. Resistance measured in caloric intake. Each line in those ledgers represented families torn apart, traditions interrupted, a way of life being systematically dismantled through bureaucratic efficiency. Signal stations overlooked each agency, their mirrors ready to flash warnings of any disturbance to nearby military posts. If too many young men gathered in one place, warning sent. If families tried to slip away at night, cavalry dispatched before dawn. If someone killed agency cattle without permission, soldiers arrived with suspicious speed. The surveillance was constant, invisible, inescapable. Most heartbreaking were the small tragedies that added up to cultural annihilation. When young warriors slipped away to hunt deer illegally, trying to feel like men again instead of ration recipients, heliograph messages ensured cavalry intercepted them at every crossing, every waterhole, every place game might be found. Families attempting to visit relatives at other agencies, a basic human need to see loved ones, found soldiers waiting at every river ford, every mountain pass, checking papers and turning back anyone without proper authorization. The signal network had transformed the vast plains into an open-air prison, where invisible walls were made of light and information. You couldn't see the boundaries, but they were more real than any fence. Step outside them, and mirrors would flash your location faster than you could ride. Try to move as your ancestors had moved for 10,000 years, and bureaucrats with clipboards would note your absence and telegraph ahead. Children born that winter would never know true freedom. They would grow up within sight of the sacred Black Hills, but forbidden to enter them. They would learn to ride horses, not to hunt buffalo, but to herd cattle on land allotted by distant officials. They would hear stories of Little Bighorn and Crazy Horse and the Golden Age, but these would become legends, myths, tales of a world as distant as ancient Troy. By spring of 1877, organized resistance had ended. The mighty Sioux nation, which had defeated armies and terrified settlers and ruled an empire of grass, had been conquered by mirrors and sunbeams and the cold efficiency of coordinated military intelligence. Not through superior courage, the Sioux warriors had proven their bravery beyond doubt. Not through superior tactics, Little Bighorn had demonstrated who understood warfare better, but through information, through networks, through the ability to see and coordinate and respond faster than horses could. Gallop or smoke signals could rise. The last free band surrendered on a May morning when wildflowers were beginning to bloom across the prairie. Their leader riding forward slowly, rifle held across his lap, prepared to hand it over to Colonel Miles, who waited with an expression of satisfaction tempered by respect. Above them, on a peak where young warriors had once sought visions, a heliograph operator adjusted his mirror and flashed the news to headquarters. The message bouncing from station to station across the network. Last hostiles secured. Planes pacified. But even as those mirrors celebrated military victory, something else was happening. Something the operators couldn't see or measure or report through their networks of light. The final free band surrendered on a May morning in 1877, their leader handing his rifle to Colonel Miles, while above them, a heliograph operator flashed the news to headquarters. Last hostiles secured, planes pacified. Yet even as the mirrors celebrated victory, seeds of a longer resistance were being planted in places the army couldn't see and signal stations couldn't monitor. At Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, 1,500 miles from the plains, a young Lakota boy named Luther Standing Bear sat in a classroom memorizing English vocabulary. Kill the Indian, save the man. That was the school's motto, emblazoned above the entrance where children passed each day on their way to lessons designed to erase everything they'd been. Luther wore stiff wool uniforms that chafed after a lifetime in buckskin. He answered to an English name instead of his Lakota one. He ate with metal utensils at scheduled times instead of communally from wooden bowls. But at night, in the dormitory, after the teachers had gone to their quarters, Luther carved traditional symbols into small pieces of wood he'd hidden beneath his mattress. Thunderbirds, buffalo, the sacred circle. His fingers remembered what his tongue was being forced to forget. Years later, his granddaughter would use internet networks, descendants of those heliograph signals, to teach Lakota language to thousands worldwide. The old words traveling through fiber optic cables at the speed of light, reaching scattered tribal members across continents. The heliograph system that defeated the Sioux became the foundation for a military communications revolution that would change warfare forever. Within a decade, telephone lines began replacing mirror networks, copper wire carrying voices where reflected light had carried Morse code. Then radio waves made even wires obsolete, and messages could travel through the air itself without physical connection. Each advancement traced its ancestry to those signal officers perched on Dakota peaks, to Captain Volkmar's calculations and Colonel Miles's ruthless efficiency. During the First World War, Sioux warriors served as code talkers, their once forbidden language becoming an unbreakable cipher that baffled German intelligence. The irony was profound and almost unbearably bitter. The same technological progress that had crushed their freedom now required their unique knowledge. The same language that agents had tried to beat out of children at boarding schools now protected American battle plans. Warriors who had fought against the United States now fought for it. Their grandparents' defeat somehow transformed into their grandchildren's service. On the reservations, cultural preservation took form subtle enough to survive official scrutiny. Grandmothers taught beadwork patterns that appeared decorative to casual observers, but encoded historical events for those who knew how to read them. Each color combination told a story: blue and yellow for cavalry, red for blood spilled, white for winter snows during the time of despair. Warriors painted ledger art on discarded accounting books, images that government inspectors saw as primitive drawings, but which contained detailed battle histories and genealogies. The sun dance went underground, performed in hidden valleys, while official ceremonies satisfied government requirements. Traditional names were whispered to babies, alongside Christian baptisms in reservation churches. "She'll be called Mary," parents would tell the agent, and then whisper her real name, something like Wakandi Waste, Beautiful Dawn, in private moments when no outsiders were listening. The culture survived not through grand resistance, but through 10,000 small acts of defiance and preservation. When the ghost dance movement swept through reservations in 1890, promising to restore the old world through spiritual power, it ended in massacre at Wounded Knee. 300 Lakota dead in the snow, including women and children, killed by Hotchkiss guns that fired explosive shells into crowds. The last spasm of military violence against people who had already surrendered, already been confined, already been defeated. Yet even after Wounded Knee, the people endured, adapted, survived. Today, satellite communications and cell towers crown the same peaks where heliograph stations once stood. Modern signals bounce off satellites 22,000 miles overhead, orders of magnitude faster than reflected sunlight, carrying voices and data and streaming video across networks that make 19th century mirror flashes seem prehistoric. But the principle remains the same: using technology to transmit information across distance. Instantaneously, Sioux entrepreneurs run casinos on reservation land that generate more wealth than those 19th century gold mines ever produced. The very poverty and isolation that came from defeat created opportunities when Congress passed laws allowing gaming on tribal land. Some reservations built Las Vegas-style operations, employing thousands and distributing profits to tribal members. The land that couldn't be taken away became valuable in ways nobody predicted. Traditional ceremonies, once banned under penalty of imprisonment, now draw thousands to annual powwows that are live-streamed globally. Dancers in full regalia perform for audiences watching on smartphones thousands of miles away. The sacred and the technological have merged in ways that would have seemed impossible to those warriors who surrendered in 1877. The Pine Ridge Reservation presents the starkest contrasts imaginable. It's the poorest county in America by most measures. Unemployment above 80%, average income below poverty line, life expectancy among the lowest in the Western Hemisphere. Teenage suicide rates that would trigger national emergencies if they occurred in wealthier communities. Yet Pine Ridge also produces NASA engineers, published authors, and military officers whose tactical knowledge is studied at West Point, where their ancestors were once called savages. Modern Lakota warriors serve in elite military units, Army Rangers, Marine Force Recon, Navy SEALs. Their great-great-grandfathers fought Custer. They fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. At Fort Benning, military instructors teach light infantry tactics that would have been familiar to Crazy Horse: speed, surprise, intimate knowledge of terrain, striking where the enemy is weakest. The warrior tradition survived its defeat and found new expression in new wars. The descendants of Signal Corps officers and Sioux scouts sometimes work together in tech companies, writing code instead of breaking it, building networks instead of fleeing from them. In Silicon Valley and Seattle, Lakota programmers help design communication systems that connect billions of people worldwide. History's wheel turns strange rotations indeed. The communication revolution that located 90% of Sioux bands in 1876 now helps scattered tribal members maintain cultural connections across continents. Light still carries messages across the plains, but now it speaks all languages, including Lakota. Language learning apps developed by tribal educators reach people in Berlin and Tokyo and São Paulo who want to understand indigenous wisdom. Traditional stories recorded by elders are preserved in digital archives that will outlast any buffalo hide or ledger book. The Black Hills remain sacred, though they're no longer Sioux territory. The Supreme Court awarded over $1 billion in compensation in 1980, payment for land illegally taken. The Sioux refused the money. It sits in a trust fund, accumulating interest, approaching $2 billion now. The people's position is simple and unshakable. The Black Hills aren't for sale at any price. Some things remain beyond negotiation, beyond compromise, beyond the logic of markets and treaties and judicial decisions. On summer evenings, young Lakota still seek visions on hilltops, though now they might drive there in pickup trucks and check their phones before beginning the fast. The old ways and new technologies coexist in combinations their ancestors couldn't have imagined. A teenager fasting for visions might have his grandmother's blessing uploaded to social media by relatives wanting to support his journey. Sacred and secular intertwined, the story that began with 10,000 years of freedom ending in a single day continues in unexpected directions. The heliograph defeated the Sioux militarily, but it couldn't erase their culture, couldn't destroy their identity, couldn't eliminate their claim to land and justice and memory. Technology that was used against them became tools they could use themselves. Networks designed for their destruction now serve their survival. Those mirrors flashing from Dakota peaks in 1876 set in motion changes that are still unfolding. The Sioux lost their war but didn't lose themselves. They're still here, still speaking their language, still telling their stories, still seeking visions, still demanding justice for broken treaties and stolen land. The warriors surrendered their rifles, but they never surrendered their identity. And in the end, perhaps that's the most important victory of all.